Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sandy Galiff, the chair of the Assembly Standing Committee on Real Property Taxation. With me today are several of our committee members, Mark Janai, right to my right, and Victor Picardo, who are on the committee, but also joining us are Dan Court, Assemblyman Court, Ed Bronstein, Assemblymember Nili Rozak, and there'll probably be others joining us as we go along. The Standing Committee on Real Property Taxation called this hearing today to discuss New York City's real property taxation system. Real property taxation is an important and reliable revenue source, obviously, for the city as well as elsewhere in the state. It is also a major expense for New York City property owners and renters alike who indirectly pay property taxes through their rent. During my tenure as committee chair, there have been numerous proposed changes to New York City's real property tax system, touching upon a wide range of issue areas, including but not limited to the city's property classification system, levels of assessment, methods of assessment, assessment disclosure and transparency, and property tax relief programs. This last spring, the committee facilitated a meeting between the New York City's Department of Finance and Assembly members sponsoring numerous bills under consideration by the committee. Today, we are not here to discuss those specific bills, but rather explore ways in which the Assembly can work with the city to assure that New York City's property system provides accurate assessments, fair taxation, and transparency to the benefit of both New York City and New York City taxpayers. We're going to hear testimony from the following groups: the New York City Department of Finance, they will be the first to come and testify, New York City Independent Budget Office, Rent Stabilization Association, Real Estate Board of New York, and we had invited others to testify, and a number of them will not be here today, but they have provided written testimony to us, and that included the New York City Council Speaker's Office, the Citizens Budget Commission, that we do have testimony from them, the Furman Center, and Tenants and Neighbors. We will encourage anybody that is here that is not testifying, and it was by invitation, to certainly submit any of your comments that you have for the public record. And so if you can do that in written testimony and send it to us via email or mail to the address on the hearing notice as soon as you can, hopefully within the next week, so we can include it in the written hearing record. And today we are going to provide an opportunity for people to come up, and we're asking them maybe if they can summarize their testimony. We do have all the written, I think we have almost all the written reports from everyone. You know, you don't have to read it all if you don't want to. You can summarize it for us, and then that will be part, but your written testimony will be part of the record. And be sure to state your name for the record before you speak. So I think we will start right now with the New York City Finance people that have, if they would come up and introduce themselves. There is a written flyer that has the name of the people that are testifying, and we thank you very much for having a discussion with us today on where we need to go, what we should do, are there inequities, do you like the way it all works now, are we going to change, and what is our state obligation, what would you like for us to do? So, all right, do you want to all introduce yourself first?
My name is Michael Hyman. I'm the first Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Finance.
Samara Karasik, Assistant Commissioner of External Affairs at the Department of Finance.
Timothy Shears, Deputy Commissioner, Property Division, New York City Department of Finance.
Carl Lasky, Chief of the Real Property and Legal Counsel Unit in Legal Affairs at Finance.
All right.
Okay.
I think we have one person missing from the list. We had 5 people. Oh, no, we don't. We have 4. I'm sorry.
We can invite somebody else.
Sorry, you're all here. You're all here. This is good.
Thank you.
Okay, tell us what you think.
All right, thank you for having us here today, day before the storm. Good afternoon, Chair Galiff and members of the Assembly Standing Committee on Real Property Taxation. My name is Michael Hyman, the first Deputy Commissioner. People introduce themselves, but with me today are Timothy Shears, Deputy Commissioner for Property, Carl Lasky, Chief of the Real Property and Legal Counsel Unit, and Samara Karasik, Assistant Commissioner of External Affairs. The New York City Department of Finance collects revenue for the City of New York. The property tax is the most important source of city tax revenues, generating $22.6 billion this fiscal year, 42% of total city tax revenues. Overall, the city is projected to generate $53 billion in tax revenues this year, $34 billion of which is administered by the Department of Finance. Under Commissioner Jacques Jiha, our work at the Department of Finance is guided by 4 principles integrated throughout our administration: fairness, excellent customer service, transparency, and efficiency. We work to promote these principles while valuing more than 1 million properties annually and administering other parts of the property tax system. Explaining to the public how properties are valued and taxes are computed can be challenging. The New York State real property tax laws that govern the structure and fundamental workings of the city's property tax system are complicated, and it can be difficult to understand the system's intricacies. Thank you for giving us the opportunity today to discuss the city's property tax system and Department of Finance property tax-related initiatives. The current-day New York City property tax system was established by the enactment of Chapter 1057 of the laws of 1981, known as S7000A, in response to the Court of Appeals decision in the landmark 1975 case, Hellerstein versus the Town of Islip. Prior to 1975, properties were valued unevenly, with small homeowners in particular being valued at a lower percentage of market value than other properties. The Hellerstein decision ruled that all property must be assessed at full market value. 6 years later, S7000A was enacted over a gubernatorial veto. This legislation prevented the major redistribution of property taxes that a strict implementation of the Court of Appeals decision would have produced. Instead, the law established a property tax system with multiple categories or tax classes of property in New York City and Nassau County, fractional assessments that could vary by tax class, valuation restrictions, caps on the increases of assessments for certain types of properties, annual adjustments for determining the share of the tax levy paid by each of the tax classes, with mechanisms to prevent abrupt shifts in the share paid by each tax class. Many of the political decisions made as part of S7000A in the years since 1981 have underlying policy rationales to protect groups of property owners. But the combined impact of the decisions have raised issues about the fairness of the distribution of the property tax burden, both within and among the various categories of New York City properties. Under the current property tax system, city properties are categorized into 4 different tax classes. The classification of properties has remained generally constant since 1981. Tax Class 1 consists of 1 to 3 family homes and comprises 2/3 of all parcels in the city. Tax Class 2 is comprised of all of the residential properties, rental apartment buildings, cooperatives, and condominiums. Class 3 is made up of utility properties, including special franchise property under the public rights-of-way. And Class 4 includes all other commercial properties, such as office buildings, stores, and hotels. The department is charged with determining the market value of all these properties annually. One exception I didn't note is we don't value the special franchise property. That's done by the Office of Real Property Tax Services. We do our evaluation through data collection, statistical modeling, property inspections, reviews of property owner income and expense filings, as well as other techniques. Class 1 properties are valued using a comparable sales approach. Most large Class 2 and Class 4 properties are valued using the income capitalization approach. These are standard mass appraisal methodologies, but special challenges in valuing certain categories of properties emanate from state tax law restrictions. The most important valuation restriction is Real Property Tax Law Section 581, which requires the department to value Class 2 co-ops and condominiums as though they were rental properties. This requires the Department of Finance to compare such properties to similar income-generating rental buildings in order to estimate a property's potential net income and then apply a capitalization rate to generate the property's Department of Finance market value. Department of Finance is prohibited from valuing co-ops and condos using sales data. Consequently, each year, DOF must use statistical modeling and assessor reviews to develop rental comparables, which serve as the basis for valuing what are predominantly owner-occupied properties. Real Property Tax Law 581 creates parity issues regarding the valuations of different types of residential properties and of different subsets of co-ops and condos. Because DOF values rental properties based on annually submitted real property income and expense data and does not project the future cash flow of a property and potential future uses of a property, which investors generally do in valuing a property, Class II property values are generally below their fair market values based on sales. And co-ops and condos tend to be undervalued more than rental properties, in part because regulated or partially regulated apartment buildings can serve as comparables for co-ops and condos in prime real estate locations. Real Property Tax Law 581 creates special issues in valuing high-end co-op and condo apartment buildings, for which finding adequate rental comparables can be problematic. Understanding how comparables work and why they are used is not intuitive for property owners. Valuing properties by methods that are artificial and not used by property owners when they buy and sell their homes creates confusion for owners and major transparency issues for the Department of Finance in explaining values used for city property tax purposes. As important as valuation is to the property tax system, it is only the first step in determining property taxes. After values are determined, market value is converted into assessed value, the value to which New York City property tax rates are applied. As noted, the law allows fractional assessments of properties, and each tax class has a target assessed value market value ratio. Assessed value cannot exceed the target ratios. The current target assessed value ratio for tax classes 2, 3, and 4 is 45%, while the ratio for tax class 1 is 6%. Class 1's ratio is lower, at least in part, because the Department of Finance values for small homes are closer to sales-based values than for properties in the other tax classes. The effective assessed value ratios, assessed values compared to sales-based market values of larger residential properties and income-generating commercial properties, are generally well below 45%. To protect small homes and small residential apartment buildings with fewer than 11 units from large year-over-year tax increases, statutory restrictions limit the annual increases in assessed value that they can receive to 6% a year or 20% over 5 years for Class 1 properties, and 8% a year or 30% over 5 years for small Class 2 properties. While these caps were created to protect small property owners, they create inequities when market value growth exceeds assessed value growth in some neighborhoods but not others. And they create confusion when the assessed value increases in years when market value decreases or stays the same, which occurs when an assessed value rises to the target ratio to catch up for caps imposed in more prosperous years. After a property's assessed value is determined, exemptions are applied. Exemptions are enacted to serve public policy purposes, whether to incentivize construction or renovations or to assist a vulnerable section of the population. But property tax exemptions add to disparities in the effective tax rates paid by similar type properties. Once taxable assessed value is determined, there are additional steps to determining a property's tax liability. As noted, the city's 4 tax class system was established in 1981 as a result of the Court of Appeals decision in 1975 that all properties must be valued at fair market value. Each class is responsible for a share of the total tax burden or tax levy. The initial class years were based on each class year of total assessed value in fiscal year 1982, which codified historical inequities in assessment practices. Shares were to be adjusted annually to reflect exemption changes, reclassification of properties, and physical changes, such as new construction and demolitions. The law also required periodic adjustments to reflect changes in market value, but this did not occur until 1993. In fact, due to political decisions, the levy share for Class 1 small homeowners relative to its market value share decreased in the 1980s. Beginning in fiscal year 1992, a mandatory adjustment to class years based on market value was established, but the base year used for determining class years was fiscal year 1991, securing the reductions in the levy share to market value share ratio for Class 1 that occurred over the prior decade. Statutorily, the annual adjustment to any tax class share of the levy cannot increase by more than 5%. But in many years since the new methodology was implemented, the city has sought legislation to lower the cap below 5%, primarily to the benefit of Class 1 property owners. A tax class share of the levy is directly related to the tax rate computation for the class. Once the levy share is determined, it is then divided by the tax class total taxable assessed value to compute its tax rate. The final step in computing liabilities is the implementation of abatements, which reduces the tax liability of eligible owners after taxes are calculated. This brief overview of how tax liability is computed and the impact of political decisions over the years highlights that while the Department of Finance's job is to value properties fairly and equitably, the valuation methods are impacted by legal constraints. Most importantly, the ultimate tax burden of different types of property owners reflect both historical and current-day political decisions. To summarize, issues regarding the relative tax burdens of different residential groups, homeowners, co-ops, and condo owners and rental properties, and the relative tax burdens of property within the groups are primarily the product of assessment increase caps adopted to protect select property owners from large annual tax increases, legally mandated restrictions on how co-ops and condos are valued, political decisions regarding the relative share of the tax burden borne by classes 1 and 2, and the impact of exemptions and abatements adopted to address equity and housing stock issues. Issues regarding the relative tax burden borne by commercial versus residential properties also reflect political decisions regarding the tax levy shares borne by the different tax classes. At the Department of Finance, our responsibility is to value properties accurately and to administer the property tax fairly within the parameters that New York State and New York City laws allow. To return to my opening comment, our work at the Department of Finance is guided by 4 principles of fairness, customer service, transparency, and efficiency, which means we work hard to promote and bolster these principles as we administer the tax laws. Therefore, we strive for fairness in our valuations. Our goal is to treat like properties similarly as we value properties. We have made great strides through the hiring of additional assessors, enhanced assessor training, empirical modeling, and improved data collection. All of this has improved the accuracy of our values, including the quality of comparables selected for valuing co-op and condominium buildings. We are also in the process of upgrading our technological infrastructure for property tax administration, which will provide a much more vibrant set of electronic services for the public. We are re-engineering our exemption processes to ensure that eligible applicants receive the benefits they deserve. We are streamlining our application process to simplify filing requirements for property owners. As part of these efforts last year, we launched a short form for some owners to use when they file their real property income and expense statements. The new form is available to 31,000 tax class 2 and 4 required filers and makes it easier and faster for them to comply with the requirement to annually submit income and expenses to the department. Another component of our mission to provide quality customer service was the creation last year of the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. This independent office within DOF assists the public with issues they may have regarding DOF's administration of the property tax, as well with other city-administered taxes, and make recommendations to address systemic agency issues. The Office of the Taxpayer Advocate recently developed a Taxpayer Bill of Rights. This document clearly explains to New Yorkers what their rights are when they're interacting with the Department of Finance. This information is translated into multiple languages and is available on our website, at our public business centers, and elsewhere. In the last week, we sent every property owner in the city a copy of the Bill of Rights along with their January notice of property value. Our efforts in customer service extend to the outreach we do to help people understand how property taxes work. The above-mentioned notices of property values include details about each property in the city and how the property was valued. It also informs the public how they can challenge their values if they believe they are not correct, and when and where we will be holding public workshops throughout the 5 boroughs where we offer in-person assistance to anyone who has questions about their values. We have developed property tax guides that use clear language and infographics to break down the property tax system for all residential property owners. These guides are translated into multiple languages, and our outreach team uses them year-round at events with property owners. We are constantly improving our website to provide access to a variety of comprehensive materials that explain property valuation methods, assessed valuation rules, details on property roll data, and general information on New York City property taxes. Last year, the agency released interactive web maps displaying property information for Class 1 homes. In a few weeks, we will be releasing the same maps for Class 2 residential properties. In conclusion, we believe that we have made great progress at the Department of Finance in improving our business processes and customer service, and we remain focused on additional enhancements. The improvements we are implementing are relevant even if components of the property tax system were to be changed. Property tax reform obviously raises important and complicated political and policy issues. There are multiple interrelated steps to determining a property's tax liability. So changing one part must take into account the implication for other parts of the computation. For example, as I've noted, Class 1 properties are valued using comparable sales, and Class 2 co-ops and condos are valued as required by law, as though they are rental buildings, which results in lower than sales-based values. But the taxes paid by properties are also affected by assessed value rules, class share treatment, and exemption and abatements. Department of Finance studies have found that, although Department of Finance market values at the unit level are very different for small homes than for co-ops and condominiums, at least in some years, the median effective tax rate, taxes as the percentage of estimated sales-based values paid by small homes, is not that different than the median rate paid by co-ops and condo buildings. Variability around the median, however, can be significant. Reforming the New York City property tax system will require some hard political decisions. Balancing the goals of tax equity, tax burden stability at the parcel level, and New York City tax revenue stability at the macro level will not be easy. Ultimately, tax reform will likely require at least some redistribution of the tax burden, and the losers will not be shy about expressing their opinions. Despite these challenges, today's hearing is an important step in highlighting issues regarding the property tax system. Thank you.
I thank you for your comments. Does anybody else have a presentation, or we're just going to answer questions? I just have one question. You know, I live in Westchester County, so I don't get your bills, but I get my own tax bills. But this is so interesting to know what you said about the Hellerstein decision in the 70s that changed all this, because we in Westchester also have the co-op condo issue where people are paying a third of what they really should be paying in taxes. It's been a tremendous issue for us, but we are following what happened in New York City and how you do it. So, but I just wondered, you closed with, this is kind of the beginning and highlighting the property tax situation problems, and you outlined on page 6 and 7 4 areas that that need to be looked at. As we leave here today, is the city council, is the mayor, are they all engaged with your department on trying to come to some conclusions and make recommendations to it? Are we at that stage yet?
I think we're at the stage where we're exploring internally and trying to analyze different options. As I said, there's so many interconnected parts. I think from the Department of Finance point of view, we do try to separate the valuation issues, and as I mentioned, we do think that real property tax law 581 is an issue for valuation versus all the layers of kind of, state law that ultimately affects how assessed value is computed in taxes. So, I think the bottom line questions are going to come down to what do you do with the distribution of the tax burden, and whether or not you can then build in protections going forward so that there aren't any dramatic impacts. So a lot of what we spend time doing is generally as a revenue neutral model, we'll look at various iterations, and those do get discussed within the administration. But I don't think we're at a point yet where there's any formal recommendations. We're just trying to study and understand the implications of of approaching it from different angles.
Right. So there's no bill that's coming to us from the city with any recommendations at this point?
There's no immediate legislation.
Before the end of session?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. All right. Mark, Victor, why don't you start?
I'll defer to my colleagues. Go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner, for that lengthy explanation of a very complicated system, which I think you just made even more complicated for many of us. Can you help simplify a little bit more for me? And the 4 tax classes, and I understand tax 1 is 1 to 3 families, 2 rentals, co-ops and condos, 3 utilities, and 4 would be
All of the
hotels
commercial.
and all commercial and all above. What is the tax rate for each 4 categories?
I don't have the precise rate. I think tax class 1 is, we can look
Give
them
me a
up.
minute, I can get it for you.
Okay, while you look that up, we'll continue. And why are we basing co-ops and condos on an income approach similar
I
to
think it
rental
dates-
properties?
Well, I think it all goes back to the S7000A. I think at the time, the thought was that this was the period before a lot of rentals converted to co-ops. I think there was just concern about as a large inventory of rental buildings became co-ops, that they weren't hit with the sticker shock of having sales-based values. But as I said, the valuation is a very important part of it. It's not really, it's just one layer of how you ultimately get to tax liability. But I think in origins, it does go back to the fact that the law dates back to 1981. And at that time, the volume of co-ops was much smaller. And there was concern about, as rentals went to co-ops, that they kind of keep the same method, that they would be valued as a rental.
But you also, it's 35 years later, and we still don't have any real suggestions on how to uniform this complicated, unfair tax code.
Well, I guess the issue that frequently comes up is, what's the ultimate burden for different subgroups? I mean, there's well-intentioned laws that have been passed to try to protect certain categories of property owners from large annual tax increases, but then when you look at them compared to other subgroups, that creates equity issues. So, it's kind of like if you did a revenue-neutral approach and you basically just said everyone's going to pay the same effective tax rate, there would be significant redistribution of the tax burden. So I think that's kind of the ultimate political question. And then the issue going forward is thinking about what kind of protections you would want to build in. It may be, for certain segments, based on income or age or stuff that you can build protections into the system. But I do think that part of the problem over the years has been the winners and losers equation. That if the city feels very strongly the revenues are needed for city budget purposes, and if you start from a revenue neutral premise, reform is going to produce winners and losers.
In your opinion, who are the losers here from all the 4 tax classes?
I think, I think it is generally recognized that Class 1 homeowners do benefit from the assessment increase caps year over year.
Who would that loser be?
Well, it varies. I mean, part of it is not just one class, it's also the distribution within the classes, that different subgroups, like, if you're in a gentrifying area of the city, you may have a different experience than if you're not in a non-gentrifying area. So when you look at across, so one way we look at it is if you put everyone in the same bucket, it may be more like the relative sales value of parcels rather than one particular subgroup of the residential property class. So, and I think there is the reality, and that we've acknowledged it and other groups have said, that it is true that high-end properties tend to pay probably lower effective tax rates than low-end properties, just because the nature of, for example, for the co-ops and condos, it's very difficult to come up with a rental comparable for a condominium unit selling for $50 million.
Where would you put, between the loser and winner column, rental properties?
I think it's safe to say rental properties generally do pay a higher effective tax rate than owner-occupied properties, and that is somewhat, it's a byproduct of the valuation methods, that rental properties being valued based on rental income is a more accurate method, and also that they don't get the protections of a lot of the Class 1 assessment increases. There are various abatements and exemptions that fill into the equation also. So it's also, abatements and exemptions have very worthwhile public policy objectives, but they do create issues for, equity for similar type properties. And so there are various abatements and exemptions. Like, again, the co-op condo abatement can be very worthwhile, and it has one objective to try to equalize Class 1 versus co-op and condos, but then rentals aren't part of that. So then rentals are other type of exemptions, so you kind of have to build the layers of what's really producing issues of equity or inequity. One is valuation, and then on top of it is assessed value treatment, and then on top of that is exemptions and abatements. But to get to your first question, I think it's probably true that rentals do pay a higher effective tax rate than owner-occupied properties.
Do we get those numbers?
We
So
did.
we have a better understanding?
So for Class 1, the rate for fiscal year 16 is I guess this is the percentage, 19.554. For Class 2, it's 12.883. For Class 3, which as you said is utilities, 10.813. And for Class 4, other commercial, it's 10.656.
10 point?
656.
And Class 2 are based on, the tax rate of 12.883 is on the value, is on the income approach or the market value?
Actually, when we say market value based on sales is Class 1. Class 2, most properties are based on income-based valuation. But the tax rate is the final step that's applied to what we call a taxable assessed value. So it's after you apply the rules to create assessed value, and exemptions are taken out of the property's value, and then the tax rate gets applied to what's called taxable assessed value.
And citywide, do you have a breakdown of all four classes? Dollar amount as far as tax revenue?
We do. I don't know. I could, what we could do is take a list of your questions and send you the information.
I'm sure that people in this room would have loved to have heard some of the
We
answers.
could look it up very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, this is all actually, we have property tax guides that we mentioned in our testimony, and those do break down the market value percentage by tax class, and then how much they're paying of the tax levy by tax class. So I'm actually pulling up those stats. I should have brought the guide with me, but I'm pulling up those stats on our website to find them. So I can also send your offices copies of the property tax guides if you're interested.
Why don't you keep working on that, and then you can interrupt and get back to us right now?
Okay.
Because you're going to get the
No
information,
problem.
right?
Is there a specific formula on the dollar amount or the parameters by which real estate taxes can be collected? Is there a set dollar amount or a percentage, and what governs that?
Well, I think the approach the city has basically taken is there are constitutional limits, but, being under the constitutional limit, basically, the overall average tax rate is, in most years, frozen from year to year. So the tax levy is somewhat determined by applying the overall tax rate to the assessed value that's a product of the valuation the Department of Finance does every year. And then the issue of how the the total levy gets distributed among the different tax classes is really a product of what I mentioned, this class share system. That this is where you have to kind of go back to some of the underlying law that what was put in place was a system that looked at what share of the levy should each of these four classes start with, and how should it be adjusted over time. But there have been many years where there's been political decisions to put caps on how much the class shares can shift.
Is that a city or a constitutional?
That's it. Well, the basic structure of the class shares is state law. A lot of it really goes back to S7000A as the foundation for it. But the structure of that, the constitutional limits are just overall limit of how large the levy can be. These are the limits of looking at how much the operating budget can be every year. But as far as how it gets divvied up among different property types, that's a state law.
No, so backtrack. The constitutional place a limit on the.
There's a constitutional limit on the overall amount of levy that can be raised. And, Carl, do you offhand, do you know the formulas for this? Okay.
And that's in the state constitution.
State constitution. So, and then, but the actual issue, so we're under the overall constitutional limit. But then you have a total levy. So the city's going to raise $22 billion in tax levy. How much goes to class 1? So this is basically, it gets divvied up among the different tax classes. So the homeowner's class 1 gets a certain percentage, class 2, class 3, and class 4. That calculation every year, which is part of the tax fixing resolution that the city council does, is driven by state formulas that says, there's a formula for how you compute how much it can shift one year to the other, but the bottom line is, in the state law, it says there's a 5% cap. No class can have a shift of more than 5% from what their class year was in the prior year. But there have been political decisions over the years. It hasn't happened in the last couple of years, but if you go back 20 years, it happened for a number of consecutive years, to cap the shift at 0%, 1%, or 2%. And that was intended to prevent a shift, and generally it was intended to prevent too much of a shift to small homes.
So the answer, if I'm correct here, is the Constitution formula came up with the number of $22 billion?